You know that feeling when someone asks you what you want for dinner and your mind goes completely blank. Not because you don't have preferences, but because for a split second you genuinely can't remember what you like. Your first instinct is to scan their face, to predict what answer would make them happiest, to solve the invisible equation of their comfort before your own desire even has a chance to surface. That's not indecision. That's not being easygoing. That's the autopilot of someone who learned a long time ago that their wants were an inconvenience, that their needs were negotiable, that the only safe version of themselves was the one that disappeared into the shape of what others required. You've spent so much of your life as a mirror, reflecting back what people need to see, absorbing their moods, managing their emotions, shrinking yourself into the gaps of their expectations, that you've forgotten what your own face looks like. You became so good at reading rooms, at anticipating needs, at making yourself useful, that you stopped asking the most dangerous question of all. What do I actually want? And here's the paradox that no one talks about. The thing that kept you safe as a child, your hyperempathy, your ability to disappear, your skill at making yourself small and palatable, has become the very thing suffocating you as an adult. You survived by learning to live for others. But now you're trapped in a life that feels like it belongs to someone else. You're the architect of a prison built entirely from your own compliance. You look around and see a career you didn't choose but couldn't say no to. Friendships where you give endlessly but feel chronically unseen. A romantic relationship where you've molded yourself so perfectly to their needs that you've become a stranger to yourself. And the cruelest part, everyone thinks you're fine. Because you've become a masterpiece of fine. You've perfected the art of not needing anything. But late at night, when the performance finally ends, you feel it. A hollow ache. A formless rage. A grief you can't name because it's not about something you lost, it's about someone you never got to become. This is what happens when you spend your entire life living for others. This is the psychology of self-abandonment. And if you recognize yourself in these words, if your chest feels tight reading this, you're not broken. You're not weak. You're simply carrying the invisible weight of a survival strategy that was never supposed to become your identity. Let's talk about how you got here. And more importantly, how you find your way back to yourself. In developmental psychology, there's a concept called conditional positive regard, a term coined by Carl Rogers to describe what happens when a child learns that love and acceptance are contingent on their behavior. Not on their existence, not on their inherent worths, but on their performance, their compliance, their ability to meet the emotional needs of the adults around them. When you grow up in an environment, whether overtly abusive or subtly neglectful, where your emotions are inconvenient, your needs are burdensome, your authentic expression is met with coldness, criticism, or withdrawal, your nervous system makes a terrifying calculation. I am only safe when I am useful. I am only loved when I am easy. This is where parentification enters the story. It's the psychological process where a child is forced, implicitly or explicitly, to take on the emotional or practical responsibilities of an adult. Maybe you became your mother's therapist. Maybe you learned to read your father's moods and adjust your entire being to keep the peace. Maybe you raised your siblings while your parents were physically present but emotionally absent. Or maybe, and this is the most insidious form, no one asked you to do any of this. You just sensed it. You felt the unspoken tension, the fragile emotional ecosystem of your home, and you made yourself the shock absorber. Your brain, in its beautiful and tragic adaptability, rewired itself around a core belief. My needs are secondary. My job is to manage everyone else's reality. Neuroscience gives us a window into what this does to you. The default mode network, the brain's system for self-referential thinking, for imagining your future, for maintaining a coherent sense of identity, becomes fundamentally compromised. Instead of asking, who am I? What do I want? What do I feel? Questions essential to developing a stable self, you're trapped in a constant state of outward monitoring. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making and self-regulation, is perpetually occupied with threat detection and social prediction. You're not living. You're managing. You're performing. Psychologists call this external locus of identity. Your sense of self doesn't come from within, from your values, your desires, your intuition. It comes from outside, from approval, from usefulness, from the reflected validation in someone else's eyes. You exist as a function, not a person. And here's the neurological trap. The more you abandon yourself, the more your brain reinforces the pathways of self-abandonment. Every time you say yes when you mean no, every time you suppress your anger to keep the peace, every time you prioritize someone else's comfort over your own integrity, you're training your nervous system that you are not safe to be yourself. That authenticity is dangerous. That your real self is something to be hidden, managed, controlled. You become a master of what psychologists call impression management, the constant, exhausting performance of curating how others perceive you. But the cost is that you lose access to the person behind the performance. You lose the ability to know what you think, what you feel, what you want, because those questions have been dangerous for so long that your brain has learned not to ask them. You didn't choose this. This was a survival response to an environment that couldn't hold the fullness of who you were. But now, as an adult, you're no longer in that environment. The cage is gone, but you're still living as if the bars are there. Let's sit with what you've actually sacrificed. Because it's not abstract. It's not metaphorical. It's the architecture of your entire life. You've sacrificed rest, real rest. The kind where you're not vigilant, not scanning for needs, not waiting for the other shoe to drop. You've forgotten what it feels like to simply be without the weight of someone else's expectations on your shoulders. Even your relaxation is performative. You rest when it's convenient for others, when you've earned it, when it won't inconvenience anyone. You've sacrificed desire. You've lived so long in the space of what do they need, that what do I want feels like a foreign language. Your desires have atrophied from disuse. And on the rare occasion they surface, a flicker of wanting something, choosing something, needing something, you feel a wave of guilt so overwhelming that you bury it before anyone can see. You've sacrificed anger. Healthy, clarifying, boundary-setting anger. The kind that says, this is not okay, this is not acceptable, I will not tolerate this. You've swallowed so much rage, so much resentment, so much justified fury at being unseen, unheard, and used, that it's turned inward. It's become depression, anxiety, chronic fatigue, psychosomatic illness. Your body is screaming what your mouth was never allowed to say. But perhaps the deepest sacrifice, the one that haunts you in the quiet moments, is this. You've sacrificed the possibility of being truly known. Because if you're always performing, always adjusting, always shape-shifting into what others need, who are they actually loving? They're loving the version of you that's safe, digestible, non-threatening. They're loving a fiction. And some part of you knows this. Some part of you lives with the unbearable loneliness of being surrounded by people who think they know you, but who have never met the person behind the mask. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But for you, the terror of a lifetime is that you might try to become who you truly are and discover that no one stays. That the love you've received was always conditional. That the moment you stop performing, the moment you stop being useful, the moment you take up space and have needs and express anger and say no, you'll be abandoned. This is the invisible grief of living for others. You're mourning a version of yourself you never got to meet. You're grieving the childhood you spent managing adults. You're carrying the weight of every time you disappeared to make room for someone else. And the cruelest part, you've been taught to gaslight yourself about it. I'm just being nice. I'm just being helpful. I don't mind. But your body minds. Your nervous system minds. The part of you that wakes up at 3 a.m. with a nameless dread, that part minds. You're not living. You're haunting your own life. So what does this look like when you're no longer a child, but the programming remains? Let's get specific. Because these aren't personality traits, these are symptoms. These are the ways a traumatized nervous system tries to keep you safe in a world that no longer requires that level of vigilance. You might struggle with decision paralysis. Not because you're indecisive, but because every choice feels weighted with the potential to disappoint someone. Choosing a restaurant, picking a movie, deciding on a career path, these simple acts become paralyzed by the invisible question, what will make everyone else happy? You've outsourced your decision-making to consensus for so long that your own preferences feel illegitimate. You might be chronically overresponsible in relationships. You're the one who always initiates, always plans, always follows up. Always remembers birthdays, always checks in, always makes sure everyone's okay. And when someone doesn't reciprocate, you don't get angry, you get anxious. You wonder what you did wrong. You try harder. Because deep down you believe that if you're not useful, you're disposable. You might have an almost pathological fear of being too much. Too loud, too needy, too emotional, too opinionated. You've learned to ration yourself to give people digestible doses of your personality, never the full intensity of who you are. You laugh a little quieter. You need a little less. You take up a little less space. And you call this being considerate, but really it's self-erasure. You might be attracted to people who are emotionally unavailable or narcissistic. Not because you have low self-esteem, though that's the narrative you've been sold, but because these relationships feel familiar. They recreate the dynamic you learned as a child. Your needs are secondary. Your job is to manage their emotions. Your value is in your utility. It's not that you don't know you deserve better, it's that better feels unsafe, unknown, terrifying. You might experience intense guilt whenever you prioritize yourself. Setting a boundary feels like an act of violence. Saying no feels like betrayal. Taking time for yourself feels selfish. You've internalized the belief that self-care is selfish, that your needs are inherently in competition with everyone else's well-being. So you run yourself into the ground, and you call it love. You might struggle with a profound sense of emptiness, even when your life looks successful from the outside. You've achieved the career, the relationship, the social circle, all built on the foundation of what others wanted for you, what was expected of you, what would make you acceptable. But none of it feels like yours. You're living someone else's dream. And the success feels hollow because it's not anchored to any authentic desire. You might have a fraught relationship with anger and conflict. Disagreement feels like the end of the world. Someone else's disappointment feels like a referendum on your worth. You'd rather betray yourself than risk the relational rupture of standing your ground. So you become conflict avoidant, passive-aggressive, or you simply fold. And the resentment builds and builds and builds until you either explode or implode. You might not even recognize yourself anymore. You look in the mirror and see a stranger. You're asked what you believe, what you value, what you dream about, and you have no idea. Because you've spent so long being a chameleon that you've forgotten what color you are when no one's looking. Here's what you need to understand. These are not flaws. These are coping mechanisms. You're not broken. You're a person who learned to survive in an environment that couldn't hold your full humanity. But survival strategies that work in childhood become cages in adulthood. The first step isn't fixing yourself. It's witnessing. It's turning toward this pattern with curiosity instead of shame. It's saying, oh, this makes sense. Of course I do this. Of course I feel this way. Look at what I had to learn to be safe. You can't heal what you won't acknowledge. And you can't change a pattern you're still defending. So how do you unlearn a lifetime of self-abandonment? How do you reclaim a self you're not even sure exists anymore? It starts with something deceptively simple and profoundly difficult. Permission. Permission to want. Permission to need. Permission to take up space, to have preferences, to be inconvenient, to disappoint people, to be misunderstood. You have to consciously, repeatedly, courageously give yourself the permission that no one else is going to give you. This looks like inner child reparenting, the practice of turning toward the part of you that learned to disappear and saying, "You don't have to earn my attention, you don't have to be useful to be loved, you're allowed to just exist." It means noticing when you're in that state of hypervigilance, of performance, of self-erasure, and pausing. Breathing. Asking, what do I actually need right now? Not what should I need? Not what would make me easier to love. What do I need? It means learning to tolerate other people's disappointment without collapsing. This is the hardest part. Because when you start setting boundaries, when you start saying no, when you start prioritizing your own needs, people will be confused. Some will be hurt. Some will be angry. Because they've benefited from your self-abandonment. They've gotten used to a version of you that doesn't ask for anything. And when you change the terms of the relationship, it will be uncomfortable. For them and for you. But here's the truth. Anyone who can only love the version of you that has no needs is not actually loving you. They're loving your function. And you deserve more than that. This is shadow work, the practice of reclaiming the parts of yourself you learned to disown. Your anger, your selfishness, your messiness, your needs, the parts you were taught were unacceptable. You have to integrate them. Not indulge them recklessly, but acknowledge them as legitimate parts of your humanity. You have to practice choosing softness over performance, choosing authenticity over approval, choosing integrity over keeping the peace. And this will feel dangerous. It will activate every alarm in your nervous system. Because for so long, being real meant being rejected. But you have to do it anyway. You have to let people see you, the real you, the one with needs and boundaries and opinions and flaws, and trust that the ones who stay are the ones worth keeping. The psychologist D.W. Winnicott said, "It is a joy to be hidden and disaster not to be found." You've been hidden your whole life. And you've never been found. Not really. Because you've never let anyone look. Healing is the practice of letting yourself be found. Of stepping out from behind the performance and saying, "This is me," not the version that makes you comfortable, not the version that's easy to love, the version that's real. And maybe some people leave. Maybe some relationships don't survive your liberation. And that will hurt. But what's the alternative? To spend your entire life as a ghost. To die without ever having lived as yourself. You don't owe anyone your self-betrayal. Not your parents. Not your partners. Not your friends. Not society. You are not a support system for other people's lives. You are a person. With desires. With needs. With a right to exist fully, messily, unapologetically. Living for yourself isn't selfish. It's the most courageous act of reclamation you'll ever undertake. It's the practice of saying, "I matter, my life matters, my desires matter, and I'm done waiting for permission to believe that." So if you're watching this and you feel that ache, that grief of all the years you've spent living for everyone but yourself, let this be your permission slip. Not to become perfect, not to have it all figured out, but to start, to try, to stumble toward the person you might have been if you'd been allowed to just be. The goal isn't to be fixed. The goal is to become whole. To gather up all the parts of yourself you scattered to keep others comfortable, and to bring them home. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more of these conversations. And more than anything, start asking yourself the most radical question you can ask. What do I want? Not what should you want. Not what would make you easier to love. What do you actually want? Your life is waiting for your answer.